Hold on.
pass it around so people can take a look at it. This is Mark Tanzer's book, Heidegger, Decisionism, Quietism, and we are very lucky here.
Photographs doesn't do you justice.
Yeah. That's a bad day.
Looks so stern though.
And we're lucky to have Professor Seeberger from University of Denver here today to talk about Mark's book, and then Professor Tanzer will be responding to the comments. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Professor Seeberger.
Thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was mentioning to Paul before anybody else got here that I know that it's been valuable for me to read Mark's book because it sent me back to Heidegger. And not that I haven't gone back to him many times before, but I mean, my judge of a good book is if it makes me go back and look at the original sources, part of it. So Mark offers in this book, Heidegger, Decisionism, and Quietism, some, I think, very challenging interpretations of Heidegger. And that's why it sent me back to the text. The way in which he approaches Heidegger is, I think, very challenging, very unique, very different. And I found it very valuable for that reason. I don't by any means agree with everything of Mark's interpretation, or what I'm sure you expect me to. But I do have fundamental agreement with the basic theses that he advances as I take them to be, and I'll get to that in a minute. But before what I plan to do with you this afternoon is give a brief characterization of the broader context for the assessment of Mark's book that I think is an issue. He does a good job of this, in part, in the opening pages of his introduction, and I'll cite a little bit of that. But I want to say a little more, maybe, than he does in his own book about the context, what I think is of interest in terms of that context. Then after that, I'll try to give a brief summary of Mark's book, for those of you who haven't read it. And then finally, I have 3 questions that I want to address to Mark. And he's already received a copy of them. I sent them over last week sometime, so it didn't come as a surprise to him. So let me start just with the context. The discussion that Mark gives of Heidegger decisionism and quietism is, first of all, contextualized with reference to the ongoing scholarship concerning Heidegger and the critics of Heidegger. Most especially, that has to do with the question of the relationship of Heidegger's thought to his rather infamous, not rather, very, very infamous involvement with National Socialism with the Nazis beginning in 1933 when he was elected rector of the University of Freiburg under the regime or within a movement of Gleichschaltung, part of the equalization, the kind of shaking down into a common form that went on in the early years of the Nazi regime in Germany. And Mark does an excellent job of capturing this in the opening paragraph of his introduction. This also gives you a good example of how well written this book is. It's very accessible. I found it, and I thank you for that. I found it to be a very readable book. And for that reason, I had the issues that I did have that were easy for me to formulate. It's a pleasure of the experience of reading it. Here's from the opening of the book. In recent years, the thought of Martin Heidegger has again come under a barrage of attacks, fueled by the fact that he was a member and staunch supporter of Germany's National Socialist regime. The goal of these attacks, like those which took aim at Heidegger's thought in the late 1940s and again in the 1960s, is to show that Heidegger's support of Nazism was far from an extra philosophical, biographical peculiarity, but instead must be seen as a direct result of his philosophy. Although the connection between Heidegger's thought and his political choices in the 1930s has been drawn in a variety of ways, a great number of Heidegger's detractors locate this connection within a fundamental irrationalism allegedly lying at the heart of Heideggerian thought. So the first item for the understanding the context for assessing Mark's work is that of the ongoing discussion of Heidegger and of his connection to Nazism and what that says about Heideggerian thinking, or about the sort of thought that's in play in Heidegger. The second part of the context, which Mark also discusses in the introduction, concerns what in Heidegger scholarship is simply referred to as die Kehre, K-E-H-R-E. And that term in German means turn. Kehren means to turn. And it occurs in Heidegger's writing in a variety of places. And through his writing, it then has entered scholarship for a long while about the works of Heidegger. It's often, most typically, I think it's formulated in terms of the question of the relationship between the early Heidegger, who would be the Heidegger of being and time, and at least through the 20s, where exactly you mark the transition point is itself a subject of ongoing discussion. There's no general consensus about that. But at any rate, the notion of Heidegger's turn or Kehre is often most typically formulated in terms of the question of the relationship between his early thought, or the works of the early Heidegger, and then the works of the later Heidegger, which would be fundamentally the works that begin appearing after the rectorate, after his involvement with the Nazis in the early 30s, and certainly that then continued after World War II until his death in 1976. What Mark has to say in trying to discuss the issue of decisionism versus quietism is basically that issue of the connection between the early Heidegger, who's, in terms of his critics, is often presented as entailing or leading us to a position that's decisionistic. That's the only out, his critics will say, to Heidegger's way of treating certain topics or central topics within being time. So decisionism has to do with the early Heidegger. Quietism has to do with the later Heidegger, which by the same critics is often taken to be a kind of throwing in of the towel in the face of being, with a big B is a standard translation of German Das Sein, throwing in of the towel in the face of the sendings and the movements, if you permit me to say it that way, of being, of what Heidegger calls being. So the relationship between the early and the late Heidegger has been taken in a variety of ways, and Mark offers a judicious way of treating it. That is, by that I mean one which tries to skirt between other options that have already been suggested. In another way, though, what he offers is an extreme view, and I'll try to say what I mean in a second here. That the two standard interpretations or common interpretations of the relation between the early and the late Heidegger are, first of all, the idea that the turn or the Kehre within Heidegger is a radical reversal. Karl Löwith is one of the early figures to formulate this view. And according to this, well, Heidegger, after being in time, radically changed his mind. So he changed direction. And so drastically that what he has to say in the later works is a taking back or a reversal of the earlier works. In the early, that's one view. Here's another one. In the early 60s, William J. Richardson brought out a very well-known and since then very often reread book called Heidegger Through Phenomenology to Thought. And in that book, Richardson distinguishes between what he calls Heidegger 1 and what he calls Heidegger 2. Heidegger 1 being the early Heidegger, Heidegger 2 being the later Heidegger. And Richardson, in his presentation of it, according to Richardson, Heidegger 2 is not a reversal of Heidegger 1. However, he says Heidegger 2 could not have been predicted on the basis of Heidegger 1. So they are different and kind of unpredictable, or they don't entail one another, might be able to put it that. Although, according to Richardson, they aren't in the relationship of contradiction or of reversal that Löwith and other critics have suggested. Thirdly, in terms of the context for the book, still remaining within the framework of Heidegger scholarship, first thing is the Heidegger and Nazism. Second is the question, more technical Heideggerian question of the Kehre. And third is the connection between those two. That is, what did the Nazi involvement have to do with that moving Heidegger from the earlier positions to the later positions, right? And is there a focus on that? So those are the aspects of Heidegger scholarship that are of concern in background for what Mark has done in this book. Even more broadly, and this I don't believe you talk about, especially in the introduction of Heidegger, but I find his work very valuable for thought or issues that concern social and political thought, thinking, and philosophy well beyond the context of Heidegger. Because what he is grappling with in this broader sense I have in mind is whether we can find some way to skirt between, on the one hand, the rock of irrationalism, as he puts it in the critiques, in his characterization of the critiques of Heidegger in that opening paragraph, the rock of a kind of political irrationalism, which might take the form of a decisionism, that is, of saying that, well, it's finally a matter, you pay your money, you take your choice, so whatever decision you make is what you're stuck with, or some kind of quietism or fatalism. Right? So what Mark does is to try and mediate between that sort of irrationalism, either quietistic or decisionistic on the one hand, and on the other, some version of the current version of absolutism, which to my mind, especially today, is we've got plenty of evidence of how easy it is for absolutism to manifest itself in a kind of excluding militant triumphalism. So Mark's work, I think, is very significant in that broader context, helping us explore ways that we are not locked between that rock and that whirlpool of absolutism and irrationalism. So much for my characterization of the context that I suggest is helpful to look at Mark's work. Now let me go on and try to give a summary of the book. In sum, here Mark argues for three interconnected theses, and here are the three theses that in my reading emerge as all of what he's up to. First of all, with regard to the early Heidegger, Mark argues that the early Heidegger is not decisionistic. Second thesis is the later Heidegger is not quietistic, or for that matter, fatalistic. You know, let those be interchangeable for us right now. So, thesis one, the early Heidegger is not decisionistic. Thesis two, the later Heidegger is not quietistic or fatalistic. Third thesis is this: the early Heidegger is the later Heidegger. So that in Mark's reading of it, there is an identity of the early Heidegger and the later Heidegger. And the relation between the two is, if you'll permit me the metaphor, is the two sides of the same coin. And in this way, as I hope you can see from my earlier remarks, Mark is staking out a position which is neither a reversal a la Levin or a distinction a la Richardson between the inderivability of Heidegger 1 in relationship to Heidegger 2. He's arguing for a cohesive view of Heidegger, a unitary one that does not introduce a sharp distinction between the early and later Heidegger, which is not to deny, of course, there is movement and progression of thought. One would hope so, that it wasn't just a phonograph recording playing over these words. So, with that as the basis for what his overarching theses will be, I want to then sort of summarize the argument. But what I'm going to focus on is the summary of the argument for his first thesis. And that actually takes up the longest part of the book. The book basically has an introduction and conclusion. Sandwiched between those two is the meat of it, which are two chapters, one of which dealing with the early Heidegger, which is the longest of all the chapters by far. And then the second chapter dealing with the later Heidegger. So decisionism in the long chapter, quietism in the less long chapter. And I'll spend most of my time in summary in terms of the argument for the first part of Mark's book, that Heidegger is not that the early Heidegger is not decisionistic. That'll set me up, I hope, to be pretty brief on my summary of the second and the third theses, that the later Heidegger is not quietistic, and that Heidegger 1 is Heidegger 2, or that there isn't a distinction between Heidegger 1 and Heidegger 2. So bear with me, this part I'm pretty well just going to read, and this I did send Mark in advance, so I haven't really messed around with it. That's very tricky on this. So the view, here's the argument for thesis 1, that early Heidegger is not decisionist. The view that Heidegger's analyses in being and time lead to decisionism are based on a misinterpretation of Heidegger's concept of freedom in that work. In the attacks against him, the concept of freedom in being and time is taken to be the equivalent to the so-called existentialist notion of freedom, which equates freedom with unconstrained arbitrariness. However, that is not at all what freedom means for Heidegger. Remember, throughout I'm just summarizing Marx, so it's he who is talking through my voice or in my interpretation of what he said. So it's not at all the case that freedom means for Heidegger what we take the standard existentialist notion of freedom to be as unrestrained arbitrariness. Rather, Heideggerian freedom, which is to say the freedom of what Heidegger calls Dasein. I don't know if you're all familiar with the terminology of being and time, but that being that I am, that each of us is, Heidegger uses a special name for that. It's not, it's a common German word, but he gives it his own tweaking and his own restrictions. Heidegger uses the term Dasein, which means literally the Da is a preface meaning there, and Sein is to be. So Dasein is being there, to be there. The being that each of us is a matter of being there, of a there being. Exactly what that means, maybe we'll talk about in more length as we get into it. You who are in Mark's seminar, I'm sure have already been talking about it at great length. And anyway, the Heideggerian freedom then isn't arbitrariness or unrestricted choice. Rather, it is, quote, a self-restrictive freedom which takes its own self-achievement as its end, and which possesses an indeterminate yet violable criteria for such self-achievement by virtue of the essential indeterminacy of the free subject itself. That's a direct quote. Let me reread it because I think it's a nice, succinct statement of what Marcus is arguing at this point. So the concept of Heideggerian freedom is not arbitrariness. It's instead this. It's, quote, a self-restrictive freedom which takes its own self-achievement as its end and which possesses an indeterminate yet violable criterion for such self-achievement by virtue of the essential indeterminacy of the free subject itself. Let me just pull out for a minute here. What Mark is working with there is the combination of the notions of indeterminate yet violable. If one has an indeterminate principle which cannot be violated, then by Heidegger's critics and by Marx's own argument, one would indeed seem to have no alternative but decisionism. That is, if the criterion by which I assess my own actions are totally lacking in determinacy, and if that means that there's no way I can even conceivably violate them, then there's no way in which those criteria would actually function as much of a criterion. I mean, they would not limit me. It would be a matter of, well, whatever I decide upon, then that's what goes. And we would have no mediation between. So this is the core of the issue about decisionism in the early Heidegger. Is the criterion that emerges from the analysis of Dasein, the criterion for the assessment of choice and action, is that indeterminate? And Mark agrees that it is. Therefore, the real issue becomes, is it violable? Because if it is inviolable, if you can't even imagine what it would be to violate it, then it doesn't function to rule out anything. And as such, it would not be function as a genuine criterion. Okay? Everybody follow what I'm saying? Good. I hope I'm not belaboring this too much. So now the argument to that effect, to the effect of what I've just read you, Heidegger's sense of freedom being a self-restrictive one that is indeterminate yet violable. The argument to that effect takes the form of a reflection on Heidegger's position in being and time with regard to the traditional dispute between idealism and realism. According to the analysis, Heidegger is both at once. It is both an idealist and a realist. Heidegger is an idealist insofar as he argues that beings, that is, what is, German term in Heidegger is das Seiende, which comes from the infinitive sein, but it means what's busy being, if you will, like the running one, or the being one. So das Seiende is what is, it's that which is. So, according to the analysis, Heidegger is an idealist insofar as he argues that beings, das Seiende, are dependent or is dependent upon Dasein, insofar as they, that is, beings, have significance. That is, insofar as their very being, their Sein, as inner-worldly beings, as inner-worldly Sein, depends upon how they fit within the structure of what Heidegger calls worldhood itself, which Heidegger names the structure of significance, of the assignment of what he calls the ready-to-hand. He distinguishes, as you may already know, between the present at hand and the ready-to-hand. And his argument is that the things or beings, things as we encounter them in our actual everyday experience, are encountered not merely as present before us, as objects, for example, but are rather encountered in our concernful dealings with them. They're encountered as ready to hand, as tools, for example, or equipment is the term that Heidegger uses. So what's being argued is that Heidegger's an idealist insofar as, according to him, beings are dependent upon Dasein for their significance, for the throwing out, if you will, the casting around of the context of significance, which is what Heidegger names world, being the worldhood of the world. On the other hand, I find myself here. Okay, so repeatedly insisted that insofar as it's significant, thus Sein, the being, depends upon Dasein. And to that extent, Heidegger is indeed an idealist. However, to continue with the interpretation, insofar, here's the other side of it, insofar as Dasein finds it can never completely dominate or control the ready-to-hand. In other words, saying that it can never completely reduce being to its readiness to hand. So insofar as Dasein can never succeed in completely dominating or controlling the ready-to-hand, insofar that is, as the ready-to-hand puts up any sort of resistance, we might call it, to becoming wholly transparent and subject to Dasein's usage, to that extent, being das Seiende shows itself as exceeding its significance. To that extent, being shows itself as independent of Dasein. And to that extent, Heidegger is a realist rather than an idealist. Thus, to sum up, Heidegger is both an idealist and a realist. Insofar as being is significant, it is dependent on Dasein, idealism. But insofar as it is insignificant, and these are terms Mark uses, insofar as it is insignificant, it is independent of Dasein, the realism. Now, to proceed with the argument, the project of self-achievement, as Marcus called it in that earlier quote I gave you, the self-achievement of freedom of Dasein, insofar as the project of self-achievement, which is a project definitive of Dasein, is Dasein. That's important to keep in mind. So it's not like you can be Dasein without having that project. You are that project. So the argument is this, that the project of self-achievement, which is a project definitive of Dasein as Dasein, is the project, in effect, of reducing being to complete readiness to hand. That is, to complete significance, which is to say, complete dependence on Dasein, by the argument so far. However, at the same time, the ready-to-hand itself can, in principle, never be completely so reduced, but always has an ineradicable residue, as it were, of insignificance. Thus, Dasein's goal of self-achievement can, as a matter of principle, never be fully attained. Accordingly, that very goal of self-achievement gives us a standard for measuring decision and conduct, which is indeed indeterminate. And on that point, there is full agreement between Mark and Heidegger's critics. But at the same time, it is violable, as he was arguing, needs to be the case to avoid decisionism. So we've got a criterion which is indeterminate, the criterion of self-achievement for Dasein, but at the same time is violable, and indeed not only can Dasein violate it, but it is even impossible for Dasein not to violate it. It's interesting argument, very kind of unique twist on the thing. That not only is this criterion violable, it's always violated, it is in fact not non-violable. There's no way you can fail to violate it, or the Dasein can fail to violate it. So it is an indeterminate standard for the assessment of Dasein's choices and actions, which is not only violable, but in fact always actually violated. Want to follow that? Right, so much for my summary of Marx's first thesis, or basically of the first major chapter of the book on the early Heidegger. Now that allows me, I think, to move pretty rapidly through the second and the third theses. The second thesis, recall, is that the later Heidegger is not quietistic or fatalistic. Well, given my account of the first thesis, the argument for the second one is this. It's in short the argument that it's just a matter of flipping the coin over, flipping over what has been said to establish the first thesis about the indeterminacy, the violability, or the self-respecting character of the freedom of Dasein, to flip that over and see that a kind of inverse version just as readily applies to Sein, to being, which in the works of the later Heidegger receives at least the stylistic or textual emphasis within the analysis. In effect, Dasein's self-restriction makes room for being to be in play independently of Dasein, the early Heidegger, and being's self-restriction makes room for Dasein in turn. And by the way, to say in turn in German would be to say in the Kern. Keep that in mind if you will. So the self-restriction of Dasein makes room for being to be in play independently of Dasein, and being's self-restriction makes room for Dasein in the Kern to be in play independently of being. So they nicely fit with one another in this kind of, what you might think of as an almost polemical relationship. When I was reading Marx's book at this time, I thought of the essay, The Origin of the Work of Art, which you didn't play with a lot in the text, and I kind of wondered about it from a total side question. But in the Origin of the Work of Art, Heidegger plays with, among other things, Heraclitus' notion of polemos, of strife being the father of all things, and the fragments of Heraclitus, and characterizes the relationship between what he calls world and earth, the Erde and Welt, in that particular essay, world and heaven, or earth and heaven, excuse me. But he characterizes that as a polemical relationship, right? One in which they're kind of inseparable from one another, but not in a kind of Hegelian Aufhebung of the difference, not in a kind of sublimation or sublation into a higher unity of the differentiation, but in such a way as to heighten the differentiation through the very junction. So anyway, it seems to me what Marx is saying about the early Heidegger, late Heidegger relationship between Dasein and being is like that. And, like the two hands pulling against one another. And if you take one away, neither one can maintain its shape or its formation. So much for the summary of the second thesis, which was the second major chapter of the book. Now, to move on to the third, which is what is the status of Heidegger's Kehre, and of the relationship between the early Heidegger and the late Heidegger. Well, the parenthetical remark I threw in about how what is said about about Dasein in the early Heidegger is in the Kehre. What is said in the later Heidegger, what's said in the early Heidegger about Dasein is in the Kehre in the turn. What's said about being in the later Heidegger already pretty much says what I think needs to be said in summarizing Marx's third argument for his third thesis, which is that Heidegger's famous or infamous Kehre is no sort of reversal on Heidegger's part, although they're and others critics, nor is it even the sort of unpredictability that Richardson uses to characterize the relationship between what Richardson calls Heidegger 1 and Heidegger 2. Rather, there's one and only one Heidegger, and the early Heidegger is identical to the later Heidegger. the dikera is in that sense, and I don't mean this at all as a derogatory kind of sense, but it is in that sense, just a matter of a flip of the coin, looking at the other side of the coin. So much for my summary of Mark's book. Now let me proceed, and I didn't intend to even take this long. I go as rapidly as I can through the three questions that I want to let Mark respond to. And these two I want to just read, and this is what you've received already. One, here's question one. How does your treatment of the issue of idealism and realism in Heidegger, which takes the form of distinguishing between the dependence of beings on Dasein when it comes to their significance on the one hand, and the independence of being from Dasein when it comes to their insignificance on the other, so that you can say he is idealistic with regard to the significance of being, but realistic with regard to their insignificance. How does that relate to certain passages in Heidegger himself that suggest what, at least on the surface, appears to me to be a different way of treating the idealism-realism issue? Namely, those passages that suggest, we might say for a sort of shorthand reference, that beings are ontologically dependent on Dasein. That would mean with regard to or pertaining to the issue of their Sein, of their being, big being. So, how does what Mark says on idealism, realism relate to the idea suggested by certain of Heidegger's passages that that beings are ontologically dependent on Dasein, but ontically independent? That is, in terms of their structure and nature as Seienden, not dependent. So in Sein dependent, but as Seienden independent. I have in mind most especially page 212 in I think it's 255 in the Macquarie Robinson translation of Being and Time, where Heidegger writes, as a quote from Heidegger, quote, of course, only as long as Dasein is, that is, only as long as an understanding of being is ontically possible, being with a big B, Sein, is there being. Only so long as Dasein is there, and that is there, as gibt in German is in quotes form, is there being. When Dasein does not exist, independence is not either, nor is the in itself. By the way, that line I just read, Mark does happen to himself quote in one of his footnotes, but he doesn't. That's the line he quotes. That's the whole, not the whole rest of it. So I'm trying to recontextualize part of what Mark has provided. So when Dasein does not exist, independence is not either, nor is the in itself. In such a case, this sort of thing can be neither understood nor not understood. In such a case, if Dasein isn't, in such a case, even entities within the world can neither be discovered nor lie hidden. In such a case, that's italicized in the German original, in their text. In such a case, it cannot be said that entities are, nor can it be said that they are not. But now, as long as there is an understanding of being, that is parenthetically on my part, as long as there is Dasein, and therefore an understanding of presence at hand, it can indeed be said that in this case, entities will still continue to be. End of quote. That and similar passages seem to me to say pretty much the same thing that Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, who was a 18th century, I think late 18th, early 19th, I would call, great German stylist, and Heidegger was aware of his work, uses a line from him in his one of his late works, one of Heidegger's late works called Art and Space. He uses some line of Lichtenberg's about Proverbs and the wisdom the Proverbs contain. Anyway, so it seems to me that what Heidegger said in that passage I read from page 212 of Being and Time is similar to what Lichtenberg says in a remark that Schopenhauer quotes in a footnote early on in the second volume of The World as Representation. And here is the quote. Euler, German philosopher scientist of the day, this is Lichtenberg talking now. Euler says in his letters on various subjects of natural science that it would thunder and lighten just as well, even if there existed no human being whom the lightning could strike. It is a very common expression, but I must confess that it has never been easy for me to grasp it completely. It always seems to me as if the concept of being or something borrowed from our thinking, and that if there is no longer any sentient and thinking creature, then there also is nothing anymore. End of quote. My question boils down to an invitation to Mark to discuss how his way of treating the idealism-realism issue in Heidegger relates to such, what we call them Lichtenbergian passages as being in time, page 212, that I quoted for. And by the way, and this is a later aside that I didn't send you, Mark, but it occurred to me the other day that I could maybe shorten what I'm doing by putting it this way. In most of the time in your book, you write that Heidegger is both an idealist and a realist. But at least once, and it may be more than that, but at least once I marked that you said he is neither an idealist nor a realist, right? And see, to me, those are very different, right? And I would wonder if those kind of Lichtenbergian passages that I referred to with Heidegger 212, with being in time 212, for example, don't offer us a way of moving more in the direction of neither idealism nor realism, as opposed to both idealism and realism. So that's my first question, long question, but it comes down to that. I hope you follow it. My second question. With regard to your argument, Mark, for rescuing the early Heidegger from the charge of decisionism, that the demand coming from the structure of Dasein itself, that Dasein achieve itself, his argument that in order to rescue from decisionism, what he does is say that, well, Dasein by its very structure must achieve itself, and that that's a demand which is both indeterminate and yet violable, because it's always actually necessarily violated, but it cannot not be violated. And so remember that from my summary. My question is this: just how does the notion of Dasein achieving itself stand to the notion of Dasein being authentic? It seems to me that one could plausibly argue something along the following lines. To be authentic, which is Heidegger's term, as you know, not that he coined it or anything, but it plays a crucial role in being authentic. To be authentic requires, at least for one thing, that Dasein, here's the argument I might give, that Dasein give up the pretense or illusion that indeed it ever could achieve itself. I mean, one reading of authenticity that I would probably proffer is, well, to be authentic is precisely to give up this kind of illusion of ever being able to achieve myself. Right? And as Mark points out, the notion of such self-achievement, at least as he's defined it, is an impossibility for Dasein as Dasein. It's not even conceivable for Dasein to achieve itself in that sense. But only if authenticity equals self-achievement would it then follow that authenticity itself is an always and necessarily violated call upon Dasein. Furthermore, so if authenticity is broken from self-achievement, I'm not sure that it follows any longer that the call is indeterminate yet viable because always violated. That's what I'm trying to zero in on. Furthermore, one could go on to call or demand or command to become authentic, which is what, according to Heidegger, conscience is. Conscience is a call of Dasein to Dasein, of the authentic Dasein to the inauthentic Dasein to become authentic, in short. Okay, so could be that the call is still, that call to become authentic is itself still both indeterminate in one important sense, while yet remaining violable, without, however, being always violated. However, that would not be, as it is for what you call self-achievement, because it's always actually violated. Rather, it would have to do with the very nature of the call of conscience as utterly concrete and individualizing for Dasein, which Heidegger argues it is. Conscience, and he'll connect it with death, as many of you I'm sure already know. But in that connection, it has to do with the radical individualizing of Dasein. So the call of conscience, which is, among other things, the call to anticipate death, is one which radically individualizes Dasein. Well, quite clearly, that opens an understanding of indeterminacy, which means, well, of course, that call cannot be given determinate content if you mean by that a content that would cut across all Dasein. So that what my call is would become equivalent to concretely speaking, my call would become then equivalent to Marx. That is, the call would be indeterminate in the sense it could not be reduced to any one-size-fits-all formula to apply to every Dasein alike, as does, for example, the commandment not to kill. but it would hardly be indeterminate for the particular Dasein. Instead, we might say that its indeterminacy at the level of general rules or principles, the indeterminacy of the criteria of consciousness, was a function of its over-determination, its hyper-determination, at the level of individual Dasein in the concrete situation. It might well take a good deal of discernment, to borrow that word from Ignatian spiritual direction tradition, right? It might well take a good deal of discernment for Dasein to hear the call clearly, to find out what it is my conscience is calling upon me to do in any given situation. That may well be the case. But once I did hear it, there'd be nothing at all indeterminate about it, including anything impossible about it, in the way that self-achievement, as Mark defines it, is impossible. I think, in fact, that the Ignatian tradition that I mentioned offers a good analogy for what Heidegger is saying. The whole business of Ignatius's exercises, the spiritual exercises, is kind of tracing out how you go about discerning what your call or your vocation is. It's interesting, it's the same word that Heidegger is talking about, the call of conscience. And it's above all within a religious context, but it can in certain ways be liberated from that religious context, if you will. And the idea is, well, you go through a pretty elaborate process, and it's a process of getting to the point where you can hear the call clearly. Right? And that discerning process then is indeterminate. If it were determinate, then you wouldn't have to go through it. I mean, it's kind of like in the sense I thought it is determinate, then you could look it up in the book, in the rule book. And then you wouldn't need Ignatius any longer. Cut short the month-long process of going through the exercises to figure out what you're going to be doing. But yet, once one has gone through that process of discernment, the discerning of spirits, it's called in the Ignatian tradition. Once you've gone through that, then indeed the result is a clear decision, which has nothing decisionistic about it. Follow me? So, and you can violate. Because once I've discerned, well, what I'm being called to do is this, I can say I'm gonna follow Monty Python and run away. You know, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna go elsewhere. Right? Follow me. So it seems to me, it suggests to me a different model that allows us to get to the same place, which is that Heidegger is indeed not decisionistic. And I agree that hinges on coupling indeterminacy with violability. But I'm uneasy about the always violent. I'm not sure why we need to go to that point of saying that the criterion is always violent. So much for a second. Here's my third quick question. How does Mark's way of handling Dikera, Heidegger's term, relate to something that I personally have thought for a long time, which is, as I put it in some writing from many years ago, that Dikera is not so much something that takes place in Heidegger's thinking as it is something in which Heidegger's thinking takes place. What I have in mind is, for example, how Heidegger uses the notion of Dikera in the lecture of that name that made up the second half of a short book published in German originally under the title Die Technik und Dikera, Technology and the Turn. And the first essay became The Question of Technology in translation. And the second became The Turning when it was eventually translated. So there Heidegger suggests that Dikera itself is a kind of movement or epical change in the sending of being, in Sein's Geschick, Sein Selbstgeschick, in being sending itself to and in Dasein, to and in, if you will, the understanding of being which is competitive to Dasein. And so that took longer than I expected. I'm sorry for that, but now Mark can talk.
First, I'd just like to thank Professor Seeberger for taking the time to do this and to read the book, because when I read it, it's just, I find it painful. So, and thanks for I mean, the comments were really helpful, and the questions also. Beginning with this first question is, I mean, as you mentioned, I forgot that I quoted it, and I'm not surprised that I tore it out of context, because I've always hated this this passage, mainly for reasons you're pointing out, that it doesn't really seem to fit with the way that I interpret Heidegger. And so this was a good chance for me to, I mean, depending how you look at it, to either nuance the chapter or another way of saying the same thing, to beat it into the mold that I want to put it into. Those are really just sort of, one of those is a euphemism for the other one.
Two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, yeah. And so with regard to that, I mean, the way that I would interpret this passage, in a way that I think ultimately I can fit into the way to the way that in the book I present the issues of the dependence and independence of beings and of being on Dasein within the following way. First of all, to actually not tear it out of context. The sentence that that comes right before this paragraph, you can see what he's getting at. He says, the fact that reality is ontologically grounded in the being of Dasein, and by reality he doesn't mean things, he means, I mean, think of, and later he sort of says, what I say about reality and the real, you can think of as being beings. So, it's basically the relation there between principle and manifestation of it. It says, the fact that reality is ontologically grounded in the being of Dasein doesn't signify that only when Dasein exists, and here I think is sort of the key phrase, and as long as Dasein exists, can the real be that which in itself it is. What that means, so what he means by that is, it's not the case that beings will only exist as long as Dasein does, right? First claim. Now, that seems to go against the idealistic aspect of Heidegger's thought, but I think if you focus on this as long as Dasein exists part, which, by the way, at the end of that passage, he reiterates another way. He talks about beings continuing to be. So let me just read that. He says, so first sentence there, the claim is, it's not the case that beings only continue to exist as long as Dasein does, or in other words, it's not the case that if, and I think that he's intentionally talking about what would happen in the future here, he's saying that it's not the case that if, say, we all died, right, that things would then all pop out of existence with us. And then at the end of that passage, you see, he says, now, as long as there's an understanding of being, and therefore an understanding of presence at hand, that is to say, the fact that there is now Dasein, it can indeed be said that in this case, since there is Dasein, entities will still continue to be. So it seems like the context of what he's saying here is specifically whether or not the objects would all pop out of existence if we all died. That kind of a question. And the claim there is they wouldn't, right? But then he also says being is dependent on Dasein in a way that that beings aren't. So the picture that comes out of this, which sounds strange, first of all, he's saying that the relationship between Dasein and being, big B, is not the same as the relationship between Dasein and little b, beings, and my book has been saying that it's the same relationship. I mean, that's sort of, I think, the problem. Specifically, here's how he's saying here it's different. You can have beings, little b, without Dasein, but you can't have being, big B, without Dasein, right? And I'm saying that, well, in either case, you need Dasein to have being. And part of what seems strange about that is, if you can have beings without Dasein, but you can't have being without Dasein, that would also imply that you could have beings without being. You see that?
Yeah.
Which sounds crazy.
It is.
Well, the guy was a Nazi. He's not. my claim is it's no crazier than. I always couch things that way when you get okay. It's for Heidegger, that's no crazier than saying that you can have beings without Dasein, and nobody seems to be that one doesn't seem to be so crazy. So, right, because we're all sort of common sense realists, whether we like it or not. Here's why I think you, in fact, given the way that I read Heidegger in this book, that I think you can make a case for beings without being, in the same way that you make a case for beings without Dasein. And here's how I would do it. Okay, think specifically about the case that he's got in mind here. What would things stop existing if we all stop, if you know, all the Daseins, let's just pretend for the moment, sorry Paul, that only humans are Daseins.
We solved that last time.
Yeah, well. So if we just like all got, you know, nuked or whatever, that would the things all disappear too, right? Heidegger's saying they wouldn't. And what I think this passage, the way that this passage sets the problem up, or talks about the problem, is to think of it this way. If there never were Dasein, then there wouldn't be beings. The reason why beings wouldn't stop existing if we all stopped existing is because there ever was Dasein to begin with. Or in other words, think of it this way. There's only, and notice, and he puts it in terms of these issues as, when Dasein doesn't exist, and here I take him to mean that suppose there never were Dasein. Independence isn't either, nor is the in itself. That is, you wouldn't have independent beings if there were never Dasein. Because independence, which is to say, that realistic dimension of things, that independence is itself a function of Dasein, right? So it's the sort of independent dependence, dependent independence, all that weird stuff. But the idea is that the only reason why there is independence, and therefore there is the sort of in itself, the present at hand, only because there is Dasein. And part of what it is to be, and here you got to say there's independence in the full sense of what independence means, and part of what independence means is not needing that Dasein is in fact factually still around to keep existing. So the idea would be that there is independence because there's Dasein, but that also carries with it the idea that if Dasein stops existing, the things are going to keep existing because they've got this independence that Dasein gave to them. So, I mean, that I think is what he's claiming
No
here.
crazier, no different.
It's well, I'll put it this way: it's no crazier than Kant, because Kant basically says that says the same thing, right? That for Kant we temporalize the world, but that includes the future, also includes the past. So the only reason, from a Kantian point of view, and I also think from a Heideggerian point of view, that there could have been dinosaurs without humans, which there were no humans when the dinosaurs were around. I'm proud that I found that out about a year ago. That is because there was gonna be Dasein, right? And for the same reason, you could say that the reason why beings will keep existing even if we all kill ourselves, or if we all disappear from existence, is because there was Dasein, right? And that's how they got their independence. That includes their continuing to exist. And he pretty much says this explicitly when I think this one says, in such a case, that is, if there never were Dasein, it can't be said that entities are, nor can it be said that they're not. This is all that deficient mode stuff. It's like there wouldn't be or not be, because the very possibility of it being or not being, of being independent or not, is completely irrelevant without Dasein. It's just not an issue. And then he says, but now, that is, as opposed to the case in which there was never Dasein. Now, and I take him to mean that there is, and in the future, even if there isn't anymore, has been Dasein. But now, it can indeed be said that in this case, entities will still continue to be. So, first is sure to say, that's why he can say that beings have a dependence on or an independence from Dasein, such that they'd still be around if we weren't. That they'd only be around if we weren't, because at some point we were. All right, that would be the first claim. Now, that might seem to imply, though, that being would have to keep existing if we all popped out of existence, right? Because it seems like, well, why wouldn't being have that same relationship to Dasein that being do? Being also has a kind of independence in sort of beings. But his claim here is that that's not the case, right? He seems to be saying that you couldn't have being without Dasein, although you could have beings without Dasein, in which case you just have beings without being. And I think that on the way that I've been interpreting these relationships, I think Heidegger, you could account for the fact that although you could have beings without Dasein, you couldn't have being without Dasein. And that would be for the following reason. Being and Dasein are necessarily correlative. Being and Dasein are necessarily correlative, and it's together that they give beings their character, right? So in that sense, I would say that beings don't have this independence that they get from Dasein alone. They get this independence because of the interplay of Dasein and being, right? So in that sense, you could say, beings having this independence that would allow them to continue to exist even if we all died. To further explicate that same claim, I would say that they get this independence that would allow them to continue to exist even after we died, not just because of the independence that Dasein grants to them, but that the independence that the Dasein being relation grants to them. Which means that they would keep existing even if being were gone, bigly being. Right? That it's no stranger, although it might be strange to do it, it's no stranger that you can have the beings without being than that you can have them without Dasein. And one final thing is, you couldn't have being without Dasein, though, because being and Dasein are necessarily correlative, and what they do in this interplay is constitute beings, and part of what they constitute into those beings is their ability to keep existing even after Dasein being gone. So if Dasein were gone, being would be gone too. Now, one last thing about that. There's two different questions here, whether that's the case, whether Heidegger says it. My first claim is that's what Heidegger's saying, because that's how I can get this passage to make sense, right? Because it looked like, okay, here's the passage that's going to ruin my interpretation. So when I wrote the book, I did what we all do. I tore one piece of it out of context and said I'm going to ignore the rest of it because it's bothering me. And maybe Heidegger's just having a bad day, or else I'm going to be having one of just a bad day. But I think that it does fit with the interpretation. Now, whether or not it is the case would depend on, and that's part of what I do with the book, is try to make a case not for just here's what Heidegger's saying, but also, and it's true, which is another issue. Now, before I go to the second question, maybe to stop for questions about that question.
I won't even ask more questions, but you haven't convinced me, but a lot of what you're saying I couldn't agree with more. And for example, one thing Mark does a very good job of, in my judgment, in the second chapter where he's talking about the later Heidegger, but is also relating it to the earlier, takes the Heideggerian notion of what gets translated as usage, and for example, der Spruch der Anaximander, des Anaximanders, excuse me, the saying of the dictum of Anaximander says that, well, the earliest word for being is usage, and notice how that resonates with the talk in Being and Time about the ready to hand and the utility in the non-utilitarian sense of the notion of use going on in Heidegger. In Being, as Mark lays out very nicely, Being uses Dasein, does not, and so that inseparability of Dasein and Being, I think you do a very good job of capturing. And so I mean, just to offer you something that you might want to play with to develop the reply further, you can use that stuff out of your second chapter on usage to reinforce what you say.
Right, and so, yeah, and so I guess
Still be wrong.
oh, of course I do. But yeah, but I guess the idea would be that that's part of how I try to make sure that Being and Dasein are strictly correlative, and that when one goes, the other has to go. Yeah, and also again, I think that one of the reasons why beings without being sounds so weird, beings without Dasein doesn't necessarily sound so weird, I think is because of a lot of these inherited, a lot of the way that we think about the relationship between subject and the world is rooted in these old models of subjectivity and objectivity that Heidegger's trying to get rid of. So I mean, one of the things that you can do with Heidegger when things start to sound really strange, one of the sort of ways that you can, besides making arguments though, that you can also sort of try to embarrass the people who are with you, which is always something good to do rhetorically, is to say, well, it's just because you're caught up in all these old metaphysical beliefs that what I'm saying sounds so strange. But I think that aside from just those sorts of rhetorical moves, that the way that I would approach that whole issue is once you can get the beings without Dasein part not to sound so strange, then you're sort of halfway to getting the other side of that, beings without being, which then just requires that you, and I say just to make it sound like it's not a big deal, just requires to get the being-Dasein relationship such that they are strictly correlative phenomena. And I think the best way to do that, or at least the way that I do it here, so best in the sense of the best I can come up with, is to show that beings have the exact same relationship to Dasein as they do to being. Right? And that's what a lot of that stuff about how the early and later Heidegger are really the same is about, is to say the relationship is exactly the same to either of those opponents, being and Dasein.
If I understand this, I'm not sure that I do. I'm tempted to say that.
Well, Heidegger says it can be neither understood nor not.
Well, that's good. I'm in the zone now.
It's a big zone.
Yeah, right.
But maybe Heidegger's no more crazy. I mean, he is crazy, but he's no more crazy than Descartes either. And that if you go back to the notion of the cogito, would it be the case that it somehow ceased to exist? That it wouldn't be the case that it never existed to some extent. It's not just Descartes not existing, it's mental substance itself ceasing to exist.
Mm-hmm.
It would still be meaningful to refer to the mental substance in a sense, and the phenomenological project is to bring in some sense to the object of experience something of the mental substance. I mean, I'm
Well, give me a little more on that. That, for Descartes, you're supposing...
well, that you are essentially with Descartes. I mean, assuming that GIM, so far as I think, were I to stop thinking or to stop being, wherever the case that I were not to exist, it's not the case that I never existed. And he goes on to say something to that effect. It's not just sort of taking a linear time thing, or thinking to some extent, rethinking Descartes to some extent. But were you to make it such that mental substance ceased to exist, because it's not just Descartes at this point, it's, in the context of the meditations, it is mental substance itself that would have to cease to exist.
Right.
Were I to not be, mental substance doesn't exist. That doesn't mean that it never existed. And it's not just I'm thinking that he exists on Monday, but he doesn't exist on Wednesday. I'm thinking in the deeper sense of things. But that the distinctions that are in play, once mental substance comes into existence, would still be, even if mental substance were not present.
Even, okay. If I'm getting what you're saying, I think that Heidegger's saying a similar thing, right? In the sense that, I mean, how about this? Instead of thinking about what would happen if the things if we disappeared in the future, think about the situation before there were humans, right? Which starts to make it that might seem a little trickier, the way that I'm doing this, because you might say, well, look, it's one thing to say, since there's Dasein now, and that gives objects their independence, when we all die, there's still going to be the objects because we gave them that independence, right? But then you might say, well, what about before there were humans, right? And you don't want a theory that says, well, there never weren't humans. That's
But it could be meaningless.
right. Then you've got a lot of empirical data to ignore, right? And then which is fine, but that's a little too much, right? And so I think you could say this. Even though before there were humans, it looks like you can't make the same argument here. Because it seems strange to say, maybe not that strange, to say that, well, since there's humans now, we then constitute a million years ago that, you know what I mean, that there were these independent things then. But I think you could say this, and this I think it sounds to me sort of like what you're getting at, that a million years ago, even though there weren't yet, a million years ago there weren't humans, right? You don't go back
Yes,
that
that's
far.
true.
A million, thanks, in true empirical fact.
By about 10 times.
I just want to throw in one fact. Since a million years ago, even though a million years ago there were no Daseins, there were gonna be. And so in that sense, it was a world that was there was the potential for there to be Dasein. There was the potential for there to be all the structures and the distinctions that Dasein makes possible, right? And that there's a big difference between a world in which Dasein was never going to show up and one in which it was. And one more thing is, this piece of the passage is only as long as an understanding of being is ontically possible, is there being. And I mean, it seems like he's getting at that sort of a thing, that there was going to be humans, he's in, I mean, you know, a lot of times, that there was going to be Dasein makes the world qualitatively, and I use that term in the even stronger sense than it sounds, makes the world qualitatively, ontologically different than it would be if there never were going to be.
Isn't it a question that there's only a question once Dasein appears? That Dasein is the only context for the possibility of there being a question. So, if you look at dinosaurs without Dasein, you're not looking at anything. But when you bring Dasein into the scene, you now bring on the context where the question about dinosaurs can even emerge. That's the whole phenomenological project.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, I guess that I would just want to go one step further than that in the sense of making it an ontological claim. I'm not sure if you're just making an epistemological claim or an ontological claim.
I am making the ontological claim.
Okay, then then I would say that.
Because it's a question about ontology. Yes.
And in that sense, there really weren't any dinosaurs. I mean, they just weren't there, unless, or I'm not sure if unless or until is better here. Dasein showed up at some point to find fossils and say, hey, there were dinosaurs. That without that, there just weren't.
Seems to me you have to have the kind of rhetorical paradox that he plays with in that passage that we're talking about, which is that you have to say that neither were there nor were there not dinosaurs.
Right.
It's the whole
Okay, yeah.
context for any kind of a discourse about the being or non-being, if you will, of dinosaurs presupposes that we've already got operative the understanding of being, or to flip that over in the term, that we already have being taking place, sending itself, and that provides context for any discourse about that, for any possibility of meaning anything when we ask were there or were there not dinosaurs back at whatever period of time we're going to talk about. And equally for the question of whether there were or were not human beings.
The structuring expression, all ontology has to be phenomenological ontology. It's not ontology on its own. It's only from the point of view of consciousness.
But I wonder if you can use the language like there would have been dinosaurs. Like had, that is to say, what you're talking about are things significant, things that would have been significant to beings within a circle of significance.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
But, you know, there were not such beings that occupied a circle of significance. So what you're saying is something like, yes, these things would have been significant, and that captures all that the realist needs, it seems like. Because what he is...
Because there's these.
Yeah, there are these things, and they exist prior to and after the eclipse of Tanzer. But what Heidegger is stressing is just that they are, that it is that he's trying to capture, is something that only appears within a circle of significance.
Yeah, and just another, I'll get to you in a second, Dave. Another way that I think to think of this whole problem is to think again in Kantian terms, where, you know, sometimes you have this idea in Kant that we make time possible, right? That time comes from subjectivity. But that doesn't just mean now, that means also the future after you're gone, and the past before you ever showed up is all constituted by subjectivity. And in that sense, you don't have to be around in a sort of, I mean, you have to actually be on the scene for these things to be for you to be constituting things.
I think Rob might have just done something to answer my question. It sounds like the issue here is how should we understand the things not talked about? So I guess here's where my puzzle is. It sounds like from what you've described, and I think I followed it, translating it always into some other language. When you talk about big B being, I think about the philosophic concept being. When you talk about small b beings, I think about stuff. Things qua things. And I understand that to call it a thing, you have to put it in language. So there's this great big sucking sound of all the sort of non signified stuff that's sucked up in, as Rob just said, appears within the circle of significance. And so Heidegger is only wants to talk about that which is ontological as it comes into experiences and as it appears in experience or in the realm of Dasein. So far so good? Okay, so when we talk about things continuing to exist after all Dasein is annihilated, are we talking about things continuing to exist in a purely existent or ontological sense? Or are we talking about them continuing to exist in some kind of a significant sense? Because I thought those two had been collapsed together. And if they had been collapsed, and hooray for collapsing them together, but then boo for saying Heidegger is doing anything like Descartes, boo for saying that Heidegger would ever occupy the standpoint from which you could say, even though Dasein is annihilated, the things would continue to exist in any sense, ontological or significant. So that's where I mean boo in the sense that I don't get it.
That moves bugging you.
I don't get why you would even want to occupy the standpoint from which you could say, when Dasein is annihilated, being continues in any sense.
So the question is your question, why would Heidegger agree to that?
No,
Or
Right, so what,
wait, okay, wait. Do you think it conflicts with the theory, but he admits it anyway? I mean,
here's what Heidegger should say. If someone asks him, do beings continue to exist after Dasein is annihilated, Heidegger should say, that question makes no sense.
Yeah.
But you said Heidegger would say, yes, they continue because Dasein and capital B being have at least come onto the scene, and that has somehow transferred some like incredible battery to things, and now they can continue on even though the battery maker is gone.
The structure has been imposed.
Yeah.
The framework has been imposed, and it will remain imposed regardless of whether there's an imposer.
I mean, that sounds very idealistic, very idealist to me. Like Dasein has added something to the structure of the universe, and now it goes on in a different way than it did before the appearance of Dasein.
But the realist dimension of it is precisely they get to keep existing when we're gone. The way I mean, I think. I mean, if you.
The question is still sitting there.
I mean, if you wonder about why he would not say that's a meaningless question, the way that it strikes me is that it seems like one of those places where if your theory doesn't account for it, it's a big strike against your theory. Right? It seems to me that he's thinking, look, let's say we all committed suicide one day, and if the consequence of my theory is the table would go with us, right? That seems to be something that seems to be almost like when you're doing ethical theory and you say, well, the theory looks good, but here's one of the consequences someone points out to you. Oh, it's good to torture innocent babies or something. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, well, I like the theory, but now it's leading me to this crazy place, so I better find a way out within the theory, or dump it. And I think that it just seems to me that this is one of those places where if you can't account for the fact that the table's still going to be here when we're all dead, and I think this is why Berkeley says, I better drag God in, right? That it's sort of like one of those places where if your theory can't account for it, then it's really in jeopardy. And I think as far as this idea of collapsing significance and existence, right, that the idea that one of the ways that he stays out of too radical an idealism is to make sure that significance is part of what it is for a thing to be, and that's how it's related to subjectivity, right? To use a bad word, but that's part of how it's related to subjectivity. But that significance also includes with it a kind of independence to subjectivity, and that's what then allows all of the common sense, all common sense realist kind of claims. That's how he gets to keep them. And I think that would be one of those common sense realist kind of claims. So just to sort of finish this little story, I think the idea would be that there are certain realist claims that he doesn't want to give up, and I think that would be one of them. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But your ethics example, I think, is one that may be tremendously useful, because if you say once, Kantian point of view or whatever ethical point of view you want, a Dasein is on the scene, torturing babies just for the fun of it is wrong. And if you remove all babies, it is still nevertheless wrong. If you remove all beings, it is still nevertheless wrong to torture babies just for the fun of it.
Because you still got a principle.
Well, in a sense, yeah. When you have, as Kant said, when you formulate the maxim, you've essentially, and what is the difference between the table and the maxim for the phenomenologist is really nothing.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And in that sense, I think that part of the way that I would try to sort of capture this whole problem that we're talking about is that that, I mean, to put it in terms of before there was Dasein, that there's a certain underlying structure to the universe that in this case I would say includes a place for Dasein, just like it in your example, it includes a place for that it's wrong to torture babies.
But it requires
Even if the
Dasein
stuff
to
isn't
produce
there,
it.
yeah.
It requires reason to produce the maxim.
Yeah. Is there anywhere about that? Yeah.
Just very briefly, because what I really want to hear is your response to the second question.
Oh, crap. Okay.
That's what I'm really dying to hear, but,
I was hoping we ran out of time before. No, I have a little story for it, guy.
Pursuant to our discussion of yesterday evening, as
Uh-huh.
much as you might want to back away from it now,
Yeah.
if what we were saying was right yesterday evening, then when the dinosaurs were here, there was Dasein. And
If you extend Dasein to the lowly beasts, yeah.
well, and you've already suggested that there might be a sense in which, even before the lowliest of lowly beasts, there's a very nascent potential for Dasein
Yeah.
in a world that admits of the possibility of intelligence.
Yeah,
being
so I
produced
think,
with
yeah, I
it.
think even pre anything alive, whatever
So,
that means.
you know, provided you don't limit Dasein to being exclusively human and think of it more in terms of at least potentially intelligence laden, then this sort of antinomy doesn't really emerge.
Although I would just say one more thing, that you don't have to extend Dasein to anything more than humans to make that claim now. In fact, you could, I think it would still work whether dinosaurs or not, right? In fact, I could just say, I'm the only one with Dasein, and I could still make all the same.
That wouldn't
Not
be
that I would
realism.
say that, but,
That wouldn't be realism.
no, I think it still would be, even if, well, do you need more than one person?
The reality.
Yeah, I think it could still be a realist with there being one person. That being myself, but did you say there was something?
Oh,
bugging you there?
We'll work it out
Okay.
later. You have to go on the.
You've gotta go on.
All right, okay, no, second question. First of all, like you're saying, Heidegger does, and this is always something that bothered me, and so I usually try to ignore, Heidegger does talk about the call of conscience and being towards death as individualizing, does, and anxiety too, I think he does it there too, that Dasein gets individuated. And, I mean, I think in the way that you're putting this, that you can see the significance of that for Heidegger, is that, right, my claim has been that that Heidegger is denying universal rules for behavior, so something like universal ethical rules or universal rules for what we all ought to do. This is what you call the one-size-fits-all formula, right? And so it looks like if you just suppose that, okay, what do you end up with when you get rid of universal determinate principles? And it seems like you can go two different ways. You can get rid of the determinacy, or you can get rid of the universality, right? And it seems like, well, wouldn't it? My claim has been, and is in the book, that his response to these determinate universal principles is to claim that, well, you've got indeterminate principles, and obviously a lot of problems result from that. Among which is, when you lose the determinacy, it seems like, well, then anything's going to go. You can become a Nazi. That's why he gets attacked for having an indeterminate, getting rid of the determinacy of moral principles. Now, another way to go, which might seem to not run into the same problems, is to say, well, you can still have determinate principles; they're just not universal, right? And in a sense, also, you could keep Heidegger's distaste for reason, right? Because you could say, well, when a principle gets down to the level of the individual, you can't use sort of rational procedures by which to decide what the principle for a given person is, because each one is completely is completely idiosyncratic to that person. So I think the way that I'm seeing the question is this: why not say, and there seems to be evidence in the text for this, why not say that Heidegger's response to these universal determinate principles is to say that, well, it's not the determinacy that has to get put aside, right, or denied, but rather the universality, and say that, well, we've all got our own call, each person has their own path to pursue, what's right for each person might be different. Is that more or less
I think that's a way of doing
the
it.
position, right? And then you say, well, how do you discover what your call is? Well, discernment, and that would be a whole other issue, what that means.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be, I suppose it wouldn't be something like logical procedures, right? It'd be sort of like each person has to have their own discernment and find what they're called to.
Or it could have rational procedures, but it would not be kind of mechanically decidable by
Right.
those procedures.
Okay. The problem that I would have with that, as far as it being a Heideggerian, even though there seems to be a lot of evidence for this turn to the individual, is with the issue of guilt. That is, it seems to me that would be, that idea would be in keeping with the Heideggerian notion of guilt if you also build into this that discernment what discernment tries to discern is somehow ambiguous or indeterminate, that there's not a definite, fully determinate call. Because otherwise, I think you would lose this idea of guilt, which, at least the way I read it, which is something that can't be overcome. That Dasein could never fulfill its call, even an individual call. I think that from a Heideggerian point of view, to maintain that idea of guilt, that you would have to say, well, I might have that each person's specific call has to have a kind of ambiguity or indeterminacy to it, or else you could have full discernment of your call, full actualization, and then it seems to me like the guilt would disappear. Do you see what I mean? That's what I think is kind of that I would have to see how guilt could still be played into that.
What if the call was something which was determinate but infinite, and so never completely fulfillable? So there'd always be some unfulfilled residue of it.
But I think that the Heideggerian notion of guilt is stronger than that. And I think that's the issue. We've talked about this, right? Is that
this is what.
that I think what he means by guilt, and we haven't gotten to this in class, but I think that what he means by guilt is more than just there's too much to get through, right? But that the way that I read his idea of guilt is, and this could be the sticking point here, the way that I read his idea of guilt is that it's in principle unovercomable, right? And that's what, so when he says things like the throw's never over, he's talking about throwness, that falling can't ever be gotten out of. The way that I read that is, even if you had an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of intelligence, that the call would still be ambiguous to you.
I am in complete agreement about guilt being the crucial factor that needs to be dealt with there. And I like what you're saying in that regard. Pointing to guilt is that's the cutting issue. That's what it's got to be looked at.
Right,
I would
right.
simply,
We might disagree on
I would
what
give a
that
different
says.
reading. I think guilt is unovercomable. Fundamentally, yeah, if you overcome guilt, well, then you're not Dasein anymore. I don't know what you may be, but
Right.
it's built into Dasein. Dasein has Dasein
Yeah.
is guilty, right? And
Mhm.
but I would not quite treat it the way that you do. But that would take a lot more thought.
That would be another, but I guess that, what this question, when I looked at this question, I thought, it's that I mean, just like the first one, it's like, oh, here's one of those things I like try to ignore usually, and then the individuating stuff is, I've always had problems with. It's a lot clearer to me why that's important now, at least in terms of the way that I'm reading Heidegger, is how that and I mean, you see that, for instance, it sounded to me almost like a Kierkegaardian move, right? This idea that that we can all be called to different things. For instance, you could be called to killing your kid, right? I mean, and that whole problem is that, you know, and then you have the whole, I think you could, with this idea of discernment, you can say, I don't know if this is the same sort of idea, but that Abraham had to have a certain kind of discernment that wasn't geared to universal ethical principles to be able to say to himself, I hear God telling me to kill my kid, right? And that's what I'm being called for. I'm not hallucinating.
No.
Okay. Are there any other? Maybe we should afterwards. But as far as this, the third question about the turning. There is, I mean, I'm thinking about in the letter to Richardson, which I was looking at this morning, he talks about the turning as something that happens, that doesn't happen to him, or that he doesn't initiate in his thought, but happens to it by virtue of being, right? And I guess, you know, the thing that I always found curious about that, other than it being maybe just a terminological issue, that whether he talks about his own turning as a kara, or if that's something that he reserves for something that happens to being, and that he just talks about, I mean, I was looking at it, he talks about a bending in his thinking, right?
A change.
Yeah, that whether the kara is ever something, I'm not sure if he ever claimed for himself a kara in his thought, or if he always reserved the word bending for that.
I'm not aware of anywhere that he refers to that
As a kara.
kara.
You know, in which case, I mean, you could, I guess you could, it could be claimed that, okay, I would put it this way. What would be problematic about equating the kara in, or establishing a strong relation between the turning and being, right, which is that turning being, well, when being sends itself differently to Dasein, it experiences these turns, and that's how different sendings occur. I mean, that's, I think in that essay, the turning is essentially what he's saying. I mean, I guess it could be said that the turn from the early to later Heidegger could be motivated by a turn in being. And I guess you could make a case, and I mean, it would be pretty, on the one hand, it might sound sort of megalomaniacal of Heidegger to say that, but, you know, these guys, they all say the history of philosophy has been leading to me. So, you know, it's hard to get any more arrogant than they are already. And so, I mean, it's possible, I guess the only way that I could see a correspondence between those different sorts of turnings would be to say that Heidegger's move